All right, everybody. This is Doug Hurst. I'm the CEO of Third Order Effects. Welcome to another one of our webinars in our series of webinars. Um, just as a couple words of administration, if you, when you come in, if you can mute your mics and keep them off. If you have a question during the discussion, please type it in the chat box, and at the conclusion of the comments, I will turn it over and ask those questions. We're very delighted to have with us today retired Colonel Jack Kuttas. Jack has been a good friend and colleague for a number of years. And if you had a chance to read his bio, you know he is eminently qualified.
It's about 20 meters.
No, I know.
Again,
overall distance.
If you're joining us, go ahead and mute your mics. So with that, Jack, I will just turn it over to you.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks to Order Effects for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. And thank you all for coming in. I'm sort of surprised at the level of interest this topic is generating, and the fact that I spent a bunch of my life working in South Asia. I find that kind of reassuring. So thank you all for coming. Also, truth be told, known Doug for years. He gave you the broadest possible guidance that take this discussion anywhere you want. So if it turns out, the next 45 minutes are a total waste of time for you, it's my fault and not a reflection on Third Order Effects. As a warning, when I first started pulling this thing together, I just started writing. I thought, come up with a comprehensive, concise kind of history backgrounder on the causes, sources of South Asian insecurity and instability. I was at 4 pages, single-spaced, and I was still dealing with 1949. So I thought back to some advice I got when I worked on the Joint Staff, the first time we briefed the new vice chairman, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld. Walked in there with the big 3-ring binder, cut me off right there at the knees and said, "Don't tell me what you know. It's your job to know what you know. Just tell me what I need to know." So with that in mind, I kind of refocused my talk. Something else I'll share with you called professional development. Several years ago, somebody taught me the idea of the 4 ways of seeing. When you're doing regional analysis, think about how they see themselves, how they see you, how we see them, and how we see ourselves. That's not the outline of the presentation. That's just kind of a mnemonic, an analytical framework, if you will, that's rolling around in the back of my head somewhat constantly. So with that in mind, we're not going to go through a bunch of history and personalities and key events and policy shifts and all that lot. We're just going to focus on 3 topics. One is the competing national narratives of India and Pakistan. Second is my assessment of where U.S. national policy is in South Asia and some reasons why it's kind of hard to make an assessment of where U.S. national policy is in South Asia. And then finally, we're going to talk about Afghanistan, but only briefly. Questions about Kashmir, nuclear weapons, counterterrorism, China, those are all reasonable topics, but let's leave that to the Q&A, because you go down any one of those rabbit holes and I'll need more than 45 minutes. I'll need a 3-week seminar, and you guys don't need a 3-week seminar in South Asia. Let's start with the competing national narratives, and somewhat arbitrarily to pick a start date for competing national narratives, I kind of focus in on 1940 and the Lahore Declaration. Background, by 1940, Indian independence was a foregone conclusion. There was no question that India was going to become independent. What people didn't know was when and what it was going to look like when it became independent. And a lot of negotiations were going on between the Indian National Congress and the Indian Muslim League, looking at power sharing, look at federalism. I mean, the fundamental problem of every democracy: how do you protect the Muslim minority from the tyranny of the majority? Those talks went nowhere. So in 1940, the Indian Muslim League changed positions and put in a formal request for a separate Muslim state. That necessitated partition, and we won't talk about the trauma of partition, but you also can't understate the trauma of partition. So in 1947, these 2 countries separate. Pakistan becomes an Islamic state, the protector of the Ummah. India goes the opposite direction. The Indian National Congress tried to play down Hindu nationalism. In fact, they tried to be, if they could, a modern state, democratic, secular, pluralistic. They were trying to be a major player from day one. Pakistan's fundamental premise was a Muslim just wasn't going to get a fair shake in Hindu-dominated India. India's position was, we're going to treat everybody alike, and this confessionalism isn't necessary. Now it's 1947, so everything is sort of shaped by the Cold War. Pakistan embraces the United States and the US-led coalitions that were intended to contain the Soviet Union. Pakistan is unique in that it was both a member of SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and CENTO, or the Baghdad Pact. Worth noting, however, Pakistan never seemed to really understand that this was an anti-Soviet move. In fact, they seemed to see this as a mutual defense pact. That misperception was going to be devilish. But, well, to this very day, it's still a problem. In fact, Pakistan almost saw CENTO membership kind of like Europe in 1914. You know, the Austrians invade Serbia, therefore Germany is required to declare war on Russia. Pakistan started 3 wars with India, lost all 3, and they blame us for that because we did not weigh in on their side. They never quite got the idea that this was all about keeping the Russians out of Central Asia or South Asia. Some snarky smartasses say that part of the reason why Pakistan embraced the United States and the US-led coalition was based on the fact that the US-led coalition was perfectly willing to accept military rule as long as the military dictator was an anti-communist. That's worth mentioning, but I don't personally ascribe to it. Now, India went the opposite direction, talked about democratic, rule of law, secular. They tried to stay out of this simple free world communist bloc dynamic, actually founded the non-aligned movement and proceeded along that lines. They did have defense ties with the Soviet Union, but very different circumstances because the Soviet Union didn't have that conditionality like we have. They didn't have that idea that if we're going to do business with you in terms of military goods, you must join some kind of anti-capitalist alliance. So if you look at these 2 national narratives, Pakistan is the defender of the Ummah and India as the modern secular state, you have to kind of conclude that India did a better job of living up to its national narrative than Pakistan has. And let me explain that. Now, there's been some backsliding in India in the last few years under the BJP-led government and this Hindu nationalism. They call it Hindutva. However, India is still a democracy. The courts are still independent. There is like that internal check and balance system that will keep Hindu nationalism from really becoming oppressive. Kind of more importantly, or at least as important, is India's status in the global economy. It's a brick. It is the world's largest democracy, the 2nd largest by population, 5th by economy, 7th largest by territory. India is the country that everybody wants to do business with. We used to make the joke, India is the pretty girl everybody wants to date. Pakistan simply cannot compete with India in terms of potential upscale. In fact, when you push people in policy circles to talk about Pakistan, they almost invariably get to a discussion about the dire consequences of state failure. We can't let Pakistan fall apart. It would just be too bad. The National Intelligence Council issues estimates on a regular basis. I've been reading it for 20 years. They all kind of say the same thing, but I'll read off the most recent one. And this is by 2030, the National Intelligence Council asserts that Pakistan will only become more fractious, isolated, and dependent on international financial assistance. So while we're looking for opportunities in India, we're looking to forestall, to avoid risk with Pakistan. Worse than the economic output and economic expectations and political stability, Pakistan started out as this idea of we need a Muslim country. Muslims will not fare well without the protection of the Pakistani state. Well, here we are, 75 years later. There are 200 million Muslims living in Pakistan. That's only about 35% of South Asia's Muslim. The overwhelming majority live in India, almost as many Muslims in India as there are in Pakistan. You throw Bangladesh in the mix, 2/3 of South Asia's Muslims want nothing to do with Pakistan. You always feel sorry for, Pakistani patriots, because that's all drilled into their head. You need us to protect the Ummah. And yet the majority of the Ummah didn't want to be in your country. That leads us to South Asia policy. Again, snarky, flippant assessment, but back when we worked South Asia policy for the Obama administration, we got sucked into this annual review process. And we used to summarize South Asia policy, to the extent that there was one, as if our best friend in South Asia by 2025 is anybody other than India, we've all screwed up. Again, that's flippant, it's snarky, but it's not that inaccurate. Now, some of you have probably looked at how policy is formed, and you got it from senior service college or maybe a university course, and you had this vision of a collaborative, cooperative, deliberative process, but it probably isn't what you think it is. Many of you are familiar with the Unified Command Plan, the idea that we in the uniformed military have divided the globe into certain geographic combatant commanders' areas of responsibility. The guys across the bay in Tampa, they look all the way to the east to the Pakistan-Indian border and then stop. The guys in Hawaii, they do the opposite. They look all the way to the Indian border and then stop. Our regional branches don't look at South Asia as a single coherent beast. Now, the Unified Command Plan creates this seam within DoD, or at least within the uniformed military. Most of you may not know that that seam is replicated everywhere else. OSD policy is divided along the same line. The State Department is divided along the same lines. Even the IC doesn't look at South Asia as a coherent whole. When I was working with the IC on potential outcomes of a Pakistan-India war, which they've done it 4 times, so possibility of a 5th one is not that far off. There was a paucity of analysis done. It just doesn't fall in anybody's inbox to look at it. In addition to this regional myopia, all of these entities, Joint Staff, OSD Policy, State, IC, also have functional branches. So the people looking at counterterrorism, counterproliferation, even security assistance are often not in the same conversations as the people who are looking at the regional matters. It is a serious problem. And for that reason, we are rightfully accused of being inconsistent and contradictory in our policy. But that being said, I'm going to take a stab and try to figure out where our policy is. Talked about India staying out of the Cold War dynamic. We never really turned our back on India. We always had ties. In fact, after the 1962 Sino-India border war, we began a program of security assistance, not grants and aid like we did for other countries, but ensuring the availability of defense goods to the Indian government because they were being menaced by China. By the 1980s, India was sloughing off the burden of socialism and becoming a vibrant economy. Economic opportunity entered into the equation. Now, by 2000, things had really changed. Bush 43 made a conscious effort to create a strategic partnership with India. A couple of things came up that really resonated, but most notably, it was the 123 agreement, the civil nuke deal, where we for all practical purposes, recognized the legitimacy of India's nuclear weapons program, even though it had developed that program in violation of the tenets of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Massive concession to India, but it also set up a tsunami of agreements and closer ties. US-India Joint Strategic Vision documents going back from 14, 16, 17, 19, 20. Constant exchanges, high-level visits to include summit visits between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of India. The 2+2 agreements where our defense and secretaries of state meet with their Indian counterparts twice a year. From a military cooperation perspective, it's been gangbusters. Some of you who've worked the area know about acquisition cross-servicing agreements, or SISMOAs, these agreements that we use to facilitate cooperation and interoperability with a partner military. For years, we thought India would never agree to it, but we have one now. In fact, their equivalent of an accent is SISMOA. It's called a Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. Is pretty comprehensive. A lot of things are going on. India is now open to multilateral and bilateral exercises. They're spending billions with a B on buying U.S. defense goods, everything from C-17s to Apache helicopters. And we're looking to draw them into the Quad, that agreement with Australia, Japan, United States, and now India. Not so much to contain China, but to manage the prospects of China's continuing hegemonic ambitions. Finally, it may have been lost on a lot of you or just seemed silly, but damn, it didn't resonate over there. Renaming PACOM, Indo-PACOM, sent a very clear message to the Indians, the Chinese, and the Pakistanis. Now Pakistan, you can't make that same kind of, Pollyanna-ish optimistic assessment. Yes, the misconception we talked about earlier with the defense pacts left us with this narrative, a belief really on Pakistan's part that we left them in the lurch repeatedly. But there have been some major successes. Some of you may know this. Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, he flew out of Peshawar. Nixon's trip to China in 1972, the heavy lifting, all the brokering, all the coordination was done by Pakistan. Obviously, the 1979 invasion of the Soviet Union by the Soviet Union of Afghanistan brought up a level of cooperation and coordination that was unimaginable prior to that, but the entire event was unimaginable. Now, in the last 20 years, since the global war on terror and Operation Enduring Freedom began, Pakistan's been designated a major non-NATO ally. In my window from 2001 to 2014, we gave them over $26 billion in security assistance. We also had to put up with a bunch of disingenuous, flat out dishonest rhetoric about Pakistani efforts to help the coalition achieve its objectives in Afghanistan. It galls me right now to watch the steady stream of former government officials, academics, and whatnot, now freely saying that the Taliban, the Pakistani support of the Taliban has to end for us to be able to complete any of our objectives before, with the decision already made to withdraw from Afghanistan. In fact, now that Afghanistan's in our rearview mirror, the Pakistanis are starting to talk about economic ties and possibly being a bridge to China. They're kind of free on board, like, yeah, you caught us. We supported the Taliban for the last 20 years. So in summation of U.S. national policy for South Asia, there really isn't a U.S. national policy for South Asia, and the interagency community isn't quite structured to do so. But if you're forced to dig through and look at who's doing what to whom, if you're forced to pick a winner on this one, you really can't get away from the conclusion that U.S. national policy does favor India. If China becomes your perspective, if you're going to look at this look at South Asia from the perspective of global competition with China, Pakistan's heavily in debt to China, has extensive defense ties. I mean, co-production deals, massive arms purchases, technology transfer with China. Much bigger than our assistance programs ever were, by the way. Conversely, India, since 1962, has viewed China as at least a regional hegemon, potentially a regional threat. So they're kind of preordained to share our concern with China, much more than the Pakistanis are. Finally, the relationship with Pakistan, I mentioned this in passing, but I want to kind of double tap it. Our relationship with Pakistan, going back since 1947, has always been predicated on PAC good behavior, and it's been ruptured repeatedly. When I was running freaking multi-billion-dollar programs in Pakistan, there was always a little voice in the back of my head that says, you're whistling past the graveyard. there was a full expectation that something was going to go sideways and we were going to be required to pack our bags and leave. So India may not be as warm and embraceful as Pakistani claims to be, but we probably have a longer time or a longer term time horizon with India than we will with Pakistan. Pakistan will probably continue to be episodic based on Pakistani misbehavior. Third topic, Afghanistan. We're all guilty of looking at South Asia through an Afghan lens. We've all served there. We've made friends there. We've lost friends there. Don't apologize for it. But you do need to understand that in the big picture, Afghanistan is just a sideshow for South Asia. The conflict between India and Pakistan really does trump it, dominates everything. Much higher risk, much more at stake, much more deeply rooted. Now, would be remiss to say that to explain why Pakistan and Afghanistan don't get along. It goes back, basically centuries, but we'll focus in on the high points. Afghanistan always opposed the idea of partition. They did not want to see a Muslim state on their border. They were very concerned about the creation of a hard border and what that might do to the Pashtun tribal population. For what it's worth, there was no plebiscite conducted in Pakistan before partition, but the political party that won the last election conducted before 1947 was in fact supported keeping the NWFP into India. They did not want to be part of Pakistan. It's true, Afghanistan did vote against Pakistan's admission to the UN. Part of that was they viewed Pakistani independence as an opportunity to relitigate the Durand Line, that horrible British colonialist imposition that was forced on them in 1898, excuse me. That may seem kind of silly, but that's an argument we also hear from the Chinese about why they're screwing around with their border with India. They don't think it fair that they be held accountable for border agreements that were forced on them by the British after the two Opium Wars. Other issue of constraint, and this is rather important, in the 1970s, particularly 1972 to 74, there was a raging insurgency in Balochistan. The Baloch Liberation Army was looking to create a separate country out of Balochistan. The Afghans were caught repeatedly providing arms and assistance to the Baloch. In fact, that's really the beginning of the ties between the ISI and those groups in Afghanistan that we now call the Mujahideen. You probably heard the topic or the phrase strategic depth with respect to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I want to kind of clarify that. Nobody thinks that Pakistan has some plan to set up, Festung Nangarhar and bolt into the Afghan hills in the event that India attacks them. It's more a matter of ensuring that their rear area is safe, secure, that they can move troops from the west to the east for this inevitable war with India. India's concerns are a little bit more simple in Afghanistan. One, they're concerned about terrorism. In the 1990s, as the Russians withdrew, Afghan Mujahideen began to show up in Kashmir. Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, two Pakistani terrorist groups, are among those that we are concerned about expanding their safe haven in Afghanistan should it become a ungoverned territory like it was back in the 90s. And yes, India understands the concept of strategic depth just as the Pakistanis do. It's in their interest for Pakistan to keep the 11th and 10th Corps, sorry, the 11th and 12th Corps focused on their Pakistani border. That's two of the 11 who won't be there if we ever have to go to war with India or if we have to go to Pakistan. For Pakistan, the Islamic Emirate was the closest thing to a friendly government in Afghanistan they ever saw. And the quote from the Taliban was a stabilizing force, preventing India from having any real clout in Kabul because the Taliban would not deal with the Indians. I want to attack one common misperception, but it's part of the narrative, both in our government and certainly by the Pakistanis, and that's this idea that in 1979, we did things to lead to the creation of the Taliban. That's more narrative than history. I mentioned the ISI ties to the Afghan Mujahideen. Those started as part of as a riposte, if you will, to Afghan support to the Baloch Liberation Army. Guys like Hekmacher, they were on the ISI payroll in 1976. When in 1979, when Zbigniew and General John R.D. Cleland went winging off to Rawalpindi to meet with Zia-ul Haq, it wasn't so much a matter of them saying, we'd like you to set up a network. It was more a matter of the Pakistanis saying, we have this network, would you like to use it? It was for that reason that the Pakistanis insisted that all assistance go through the ISI and did their best to keep Americans out of Afghanistan. They knew that if we started showing up, throwing our money around, they would probably lose these valuable assets, and their valuable assets were going to be important long after the Soviets left Afghanistan, like today. One last point, I'm just going to jump on my soapbox because I've still got a few minutes to talk. We're all being hardwired to look at the world through the prism of great power competition, particularly with China. In fact, the interim national security guidance issued by the Biden administration last month, and I'll read it. China in particular is rapidly becoming more assertive. It is the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. That's fine. That's all well and good. But if you're in my bio, I'm an old Cold Warrior. In fact, Dennis Cahill and I were in the same artillery battalion back in Germany in the 80s. We divided the entire planet into the free world and the communist bloc. And because of the simplistic Manichaean worldview, we ended up missing opportunities and taking unnecessary risks because it made sense only in the context of what are the Russians doing? Beyond the fact that we may have shot ourselves in the foot a few times over, particularly important in South Asia, you may be looking at it saying, what is China doing here? How do I get at China? What's the Chinese interest? How do I battle that? That's not the perspective of the people who live there. They're not viewing South Asia through great power competition. While that is our focus, that to them is just one of many considerations that go back through decades of history. And it's somewhat naive to think that the US issuing a policy document, or for that matter, even a seismic event like 9/11 or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, is really going to change how the people who live there view their own neighborhood. So went a little longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to leave time for questions. I'll leave it right there. Doug, I'll pass it back to you.
Jack, thanks. Just real quick, anybody, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the side, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. While I'm waiting for some of that, Jack, one thing that I didn't catch you touching on is the fact that we have two nuclear powers looking down at each other. Where does that play into this picture?
It's terrifying. This is really my kind of academic area of interest now, so I'll try not to take you too far into the weeds. But there are really only two places in the world where you can easily envision a nuclear exchange. One is North Korea and Kim Jong-un being a whack job. But the other is the India-Pakistan border. And there are a couple of important considerations. First of all, Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. It's probably going to surpass France and Great Britain within the next 10, 15 years. Secondly, both countries, India and Pakistan, are working on developing a nuclear triad, both sea-launched, air-launched, and ground-launched missiles to deliver nuclear weapons. There are some scary aspects to this. While in India, there is unquestionable civilian control of the military. In Pakistan, nobody really believes the civilians control the military. India currently follows a no first use policy, although that's been raised as a possibility, something to revisit. India takes the approach of very much kind of that mutually assured destruction. No first use. If you nuke us, we will just annihilate your whole, your whole country. It's mad like we had with the Soviet Union. Pakistan's gone a different direction. They, first of all, don't have a no first use policy. They try to maintain strategic ambiguity, But if you look at some of the statements they've made, conditions in which they would consider to be existential threats requiring nuclear weapons, clearly they're thinking about first use. Somewhat more importantly, and this is my most frightening thing of all, Pakistan began to focus in on tactical nuclear weapons, just like we did, just like Dennis and I did. We were supposed at one point, we dealt with tactical nuclear weapons. You talk to the Pakistanis about their nuclear doctrine to the extent that they're willing to talk about it, and there seems to be this underlying assumption that if we shoot a nuclear weapon on our own territory against an invading Indian army, that'll be okay. Like letting the nuclear genie out of the bottle that's been hyped up since, August 1945 won't result in a major problem. In fact, it'll be a smart move. And in fact, the weapon itself will be magic, because one of two things are going to happen. Really three things. It's going to work, and we're going to destroy the Indian army. It won't necessarily, it's going to work not because it destroys the Indian army, but because we still believe that, thing the British told us about the martial races against the non-martial races. And once they see the mushroom cloud, the Indians are going to run like hell back across the border. And the third possibility is once the mushroom cloud goes up, the great powers are going to come in and stop us. So you're in a situation where, the causes of an Indo-Pakistan conflict aren't going to be some shenanigans, tomfoolery up along the line of control. It'll be another attack like 26/11 2008 in Mumbai, or the 2001 attack on the Lok Sabha, and the Indians finally feeling compelled to react to a Pakistani-based terrorist attack. Always try to tell people these terrorist attacks that come out, that originate in Pakistan, they're cumulative and iterative. So the next one will always generate a greater response. At some point, India may feel compelled to do a punitive raid into the deserts of Rajasthan, into Tar, maybe into the Punjab. Pakistan may feel compelled to launch a nuclear weapon to show the Indians that they mean business. And I don't think anybody other than the Joint Staff once in 2014 has really sat down and gamed out what that exchange would look like. So yeah, it's a big problem. The idea of this nuclear taboo, the normative avoidance of the use of nuclear weapons, it hasn't really resonated in South Asia. Is that enough, Doug? You want more? I can keep going.
That's good. Lada, thank you for staying awake in Ukraine. You have a long question, so why don't you just unmute yourself and ask it directly?
Okay, I'm unmuting, but I will read the question that all of you can read in the chat. It appears that many parallels can be drawn between India's colonial past, anti-Soviet positioning and Pakistani efforts, and Ukraine's current situation regarding keeping Russians out of Eastern Europe. What lessons have been learned from the Central Asian experience, which can possibly be transposed to the current situation facing Ukraine and its Euro-Atlantic allies in regard to OSD and State Department policies to ensure that Ukraine maintains its territorial sovereignty? Or will Ukraine, like you mentioned in regard to Pakistan, will be left out in the lurch repeatedly? Bearing in mind, and I'm very happy with the answer that you just gave, because you mentioned the Pakistanians discussing nuclear developments and potential activity, which we also hear currently in Ukraine, that we've been left in a lurch and let's start developing our nuclear capacities here. So basically, and as a reminder, Yanukovych, the ousted president and the Kremlin marionette, he delivered, together with the Russians, under the Obama administration, hundreds of pounds of highly enriched uranium, which were handed over from Ukraine. And the current place of this little Kharkiv Institute for Physics and Technology, as all of you are aware, the Russians have not moved any forces away from the border. And Kharkiv is right on that line of attack that we're all waiting for. So basically, what lessons? How can we use your knowledge in order to make better policies?
Let me start with the part of that I'm most familiar with, and that was the cooperative threat reduction efforts by the U.S. government. They really started before the Obama administration, but they took off with great force in 2011 to get the nuclear weapons of Central Asia out of the hands of the Central Asians. So a couple of states had nuclear weapons. Obviously, Ukraine's not in Central Asia, or was Belarus. Kazakhstan was the one that I was dealing with most heavily. Getting those weapons back in the hands of Russia seemed like a good idea at the time. Two concerns about nuclear weapons. One is that they might get used. That's obviously problematic. But the other is they might get lost. So if you take the approach that the security of nuclear materials of concern should be at least, a co-equal concern, then getting these weapons into places where they're going to be guarded, whether it's in the United States or Russia, basically the 5 countries that are nuclear weapon states recognized under the NPT, makes sense. It wasn't the Ukraine, but a former division commander of mine was an advisor to the Georgian government, and thank God I wasn't working the issue, but he was the guy who got crosswise with U.S. national policy because he was advising the Georgians, no, keep the damn things. So that being said, a couple of different issues to look at. One, what are we willing to do to preserve the territorial integrity of the Ukraine? We did nothing when the Russians seized Crimea. We sort of bought off on the subterfuge of the little green men going into Donbass. Part of what we can do about Ukraine is offer them a defense guarantee that means something. I'm not sure that's feasible fiscally, palatable politically, but if you want to prevent the Russians from grabbing the eastern third of the Ukraine, even under the guise of just reunifying with all the Russian-speaking population, you're going to have to put you're going to have to make a heavy bet. You're going to have to really weigh in there, and you're going to assume risk. Conversely, the idea that telling Ukraine, you truly do face an existential threat and you need nuclear weapons, that's going to fly in the face of not just U.S. national policy, but policy going back to the Soviet Union, basically since 1972 in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We never encourage states to get nuclear weapons. What we do is, when, during the Cold War, was offer to extend our nuclear umbrella over them in exchange for them joining this, whatever appropriate anti-communist alliance applied. Even the Soviets weren't too crazy about that. I mean, Romania had an independent nuclear program, and the Russians didn't help them. They didn't try to stop them, and eventually Romania saw a different way. So there may be a point, and this you're actually hitting a good illustration of an issue that I don't think the U.S. policy community can deal with. From a non-proliferation perspective, counter-proliferation perspective, Ukraine having nuclear weapons would just be disruptive, and that would be Katie bar the door to a bunch of other states wanting to violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty, kind of our argument against Iran getting nuclear weapons. Conversely, they do face an existential threat from Russia, and what is the West willing to do? Sadly, keeping an airborne company in Latvia or another Stryker brigade in Vilsek, and I love Vilsek, it's a nice town, but Vilsek's a hell of a long way from Kiev. So I don't think they're necessarily lessons to be learned from South Asia stability. In fact, the focus there is more on, frankly, replicating the kind of security messes, the measures we used to ensure transparency between the East and West during the Cold War, and replicating that between Pakistan and India. Ukraine offers a whole different perspective on security and stability. And frankly, I think Ukraine's pursuit of nuclear weapons would in the long run be probably more destabilizing than stabilizing, although It might deter the Russians. It would kind of reinforce the lesson that most countries have already learned, particularly with the Western efforts to knock off Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 versus our continued conversations with North Korea. It would validate the point that nuclear weapons work. And that's not really an answer, but that's the best I can do right now. If you want to meet offline, I can talk to you more.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Thank you. And I would like to meet with you offline and really like maybe ask you, I know we're all very busy, but please consider some really like core lessons learned of how do we work the Budapest Memorandum? How do we really push? Because I'm American Canadian, but of Ukrainian descent. So I'm here on the ground. And how can we cooperate and join our powers in order to make more effective policies that will protect the Euro-Atlantic community? But we'll meet on offline. Doug, thank you so much.
No, please find me on LinkedIn. I can just start bombarding you with academic papers, which I know.
I'll bombard you with academic papers too.
I'll connect the two of you on email, Jack. We'll go to one more question, and just as a side note, working with Ladia now to hopefully next month host a webinar with her and talking about issues in Ukraine. So that should be interesting as well. Last question, Dennis Cahill, and this is similar, Jack, to a question that I was formulating in my head, and he asked, I'm one of those who look at South Asia a bit through Afghanistan lens, having been there and even stood at the Torkham Gate Bridge with Ambassador Akinberry in 2009. Would you contribute to Pakistan's support of the Taliban and lack of total support to the U.S. efforts over the past 20 years, the way we treated the Pakistanis the decades prior? And having worked with the Pakistanis myself, not near as much as you, we did have that whole lost generation of officers who did not come to our schools, did not learn our ways, and how did that contribute?
Thanks, Dennis. Good to hook up with you again after all these years. The last time you and I saw each other was at Camp Doha in 2003. To answer your question, let's back away from this idea of the lost generation. Our schools aren't that influential. It used to offend me as a former foreign area officer when somebody said, "Oh, well, we bring them to our school and they learn our values. We somehow change their worldview." I'm a graduate, not a graduate, I was a student of the Brazilian Army Command and General Staff College. I learned a lot about Brazil, but I'm not pro-Brazilian. Back to where Pakistan views the Taliban. Wish I had a whiteboard. I could show this to you very easily. But let's take the perspective of that idea that the Taliban was that stabilizing force in Afghanistan. To the extent that there were any glory days between Afghanistan and Pakistan relations, it was the 1990s. More than the idea that the U.S. necessarily stabbed them in the back over and over again, that misperception of what was meant by the Baghdad Pact and the CO treaties. It's quite frankly an objectively assessed reality that our presence in Afghanistan will be episodic. We, for the first time in years, have an absolute no kidding end date for this thing, but people know that we're only going to be there for so long. And after we leave, Pakistan is going to have some control or influence, not across the whole country. They'll let the Northern Alliance go up in Herat and Mazar Sharif, as long as they keep the Indians out. But they want to make sure that there's not an Indian consulate in Kandahar. They want to make sure there's not an Indian consulate in Jabat. They want to make sure that strategic depth we talked about, that Indian influence that could be destabilizing to Pakistan is kept out. Our presence, it's transitory. A Ghani government, a true pluralistic government like we tried to set up there, actually had close ties with India because, let's talk about the economy. Afghanistan doesn't have a lot going for it. It's in a tough neighborhood. Iran is under heavy sanctions. Pakistan, exerts undue influence. But Pakistan will not allow Afghanistan to have deep economic ties to the largest economy, not just in South Asia, but the 5th largest economy on the planet. So I think we're being a little, self-referential to say, well, this is because of us, when the fact is our impact isn't enough to change that decades-long South Asia dynamic. And is there a follow-up, Dennis?
Hey, Jack, Dennis. Yeah. No, I appreciate the perspective and great seeing you again. Yeah, I think that's part of your answer about, how we're transitory is kind of our problem all over the world, isn't it? And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we, work policy and then ultimately execute operations on the ground. We have to understand that. That's why we're not getting the support we might need, because we may not be there again, when they need us next time.
And let me expand on that. That's also kind of this idea of great power competition. If we go into a country X because we're worried about China, and then the Chinese concern dissipates, goes away, we win against China, what have we done to country X? Well, we've used them as a platform to engage in direct competition with the Chinese, but we're probably not going to live up to the promises we've made to them, and we're quite likely to have done more harm than good. So it's important that we have this understanding of the long-term impact of our episodic approaches to these problems. But yeah, Dennis, you and I agree on this point. Yeah.
Thanks. And it's something I'm going to have to remember again, or be reminded every time we work with Army Futures Command in a lot of experiments. And actually, I listened to an event this morning. It's called Silent Quest. USCENTCOM holds an experiment every few months, and the special operations community, of course, has a better perspective of long-term relationships than I think the conventional force does. And I think the conventional force with the Security Force Assistance Brigade, because the SFAB commander was participating today, they're looking at a lot more of these long-term relationships with our partners, and who knows, things may change in the future. Over.
Yeah, and off topic, but I always thought the best analogy to what we should be doing was kind of that rotational civil affairs team in and out of Sotokano. Now, we had a problem with it because it was changing out every few weeks, and having long-term impact wasn't really part of the plan. But if you could maintain, and of course it only really had any impact within 30 kilometers of Sotokano, but that's the kind of enduring presence that we need to look at on a broader basis and a longer time horizon. But let's face it, we've had guys that we keep the guys at Sotokano for 35 years now. That's the sort of thing that we might want to be looking at if we want to have a lasting impact in these unsettled parts of the world. The problem becomes, and Dennis, you know this better than anybody, is who's going to be the bill payer? How are we going to keep it up? How do you generate the force? How do you structure the force to be able to have hundreds of these little detachments scattered around the globe? But that's why you make the big money there at USCENTCOM, Dennis.
Roger, thanks, Jack. Good to see you. Talk to you again soon.
Jack, thank you very much. This is, I think that there's several of us here that could probably talk for a couple more hours, but we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to turn it over to you for just any closing remarks, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, and truth be told, I can dime out Doug all I want. I've known the guy for forever. My wife was wondering why I was doing this for free for a for-profit corporation. And the fact is, because Third Order Effects is really doing a great job using social media, using webcasts, using all the tools in his toolbox to ensure that we continue a conversation about these kind of pressing national security issues. And I jumped on not just because Doug's a friend and you know, I want to do him a favor, but because I want to support the effort to maintain these dialogues, keep the community of interest looking at these topics in ways that you may not necessarily get a chance to look at in an Army school or in your day-to-day lives. So I really want to thank Doug for giving me the chance. I hope I didn't waste anybody's time. And again, reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have further questions. I can probably answer them, or I may just blow you off. There's a lot of material out here that I didn't cover. I mean, like I said, I was about 1,200 words, and I'd only got to 1949 when I first started trying this thing. And I have no desire to teach a 6-month-long seminar on South Asia, but there's a lot out there if you want to learn it. So thanks a lot, Doug, and thanks to Rotor Effects.
Okay. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.